I work at PayPal.
Oh, no shit. So if anybody has a problem inside of this world, they know who to go talk to now, right?
This is true. This is true. Yep. I can catch fraud patterns, money laundering, you name it.
This episode of Bourbon Pursuit is made possible through listeners like you, supported through Patreon. Hey everyone, we've got a lot of news to cover before we kick off this podcast. First thing is, the Bourbon Classic is returning again here in Louisville, featuring days of cocktails and chefs and parties and a full day of being able to sit down in a classroom kind of environment setting and listen to some of the industry insiders talk a lot, as well as master distillers. This is going to be happening from February 28th through March 3rd. You can read more about it and get your tickets online at bourbonclassic.com. Now, as most of you know, that last year we featured some podcast series from the Kentucky Derby Museum, and we're glad that we could actually do this again, and so we are going to be bringing back again the Kentucky Derby Museum's Legend series. Now, they've actually reached out to us, and they are offering a coupon code for all of our listeners to enjoy all three events. I'll talk about them here in a second, but the coupon code is BP50. Now, on February 16th, you can listen to Wes and Kyle Henderson of Angel's Envy. On March 15th, it's going to be Fred and Freddie No of Jim Beam. And on March 29th, it's going to be Evan Culsveen of Willett Distillery. Remember, you can get all three of these events for $150 using the coupon code BP50. And you can get these tickets by going to derbymuseum.org/legend series. So if you live in, near, or around in these Louisville neighborhoods or cities, please consider coming. We're going to be there. We're going to be recording this. However, these podcasts aren't going to go out for quite some time. So if you want to see Fred Minnick ask the hard questions in front of the audience, I encourage you to be there in person. For all of our Patreon supporters, remember, please log into Patreon and go check out those past emails. There's a post that is up now if you want to reserve your bottle or an opportunity to buy a bottle from the barrel that we picked from the Community Bourbon Roundtable from Buffalo Trace that we just did. If you're listening to this today on the release day of Thursday, February 1st, 2018, we are recording the 17th edition of the Bourbon Community Roundtable tonight at 9 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you want to figure out the link to join us, make sure you check out Facebook, Twitter, as well as Instagram. You can also follow Bourboner and Breaking Bourbon. You're going to see all of those links happen, and so you can go and you can join us tonight at 9 o'clock p.m. for that live recording. In addition, we are also going to roll out a new email list. So if you never want to miss an episode and you want to be notified first thing in the morning when it's released, go to bourbonpursuit.com, scroll down a little bit in the page, and you're going to see an icon that says to join the mailing list so you can never miss an episode. Make sure you do that, fill out your name and info, and you'll be automatically emailed every single day when a new podcast is released. Lastly, one thing to understand going into this episode is know that we've all been there before. We've all been new to a hobby, and we've all been new to bourbon at some point. And this is a fresh new perspective of learning how anybody can come into this and kind of get overwhelmed at times. So make sure you keep that in mind, and it's really interesting because we get to see a lot of new ways that people look at this hobby and how they take it, even if you are a spirits enthusiast to begin with. As always, make sure you support the show on Patreon. You go to patreon.com/bourbonpursuit, subscribe to us on iTunes, also YouTube, like us on Facebook, and make sure you also enjoy this week's episode. Welcome back to the episode of the Bourbon Pursuit Podcast, the official podcast of bourbon. Just Kenny here tonight, but this is going to be a great episode because we're talking about something that is very familiar to anybody that's gotten into this. You know, what I should say for myself, you know, I've been drinking bourbon as a lot of people know that for a long, long time, ever since college, and never really stopped. However, there does come a time when you start learning about, oh, what's next? Like, what can we get in front of? How do we get to that next stage of figuring out how can we learn more about bourbon? And then there's some people right now within this explosion that's happening that they're just getting into noticing more about the craft. They are desperate for more information, and then they take the deep end and they start doing what many of us are doing, and they start doing a small collection. So tonight, what we do is today we're actually recording it almost tonight, but today who we have on the show is somebody that's not new to spirits, but just now getting into the hunt of bourbon. So we have Darin Mellor on the show tonight. So Darren, welcome to the show.
Hey, Kenny, thanks for having me. I'm really pleasured and grateful to be on the show.
So we were talking a little bit before we started recording here and getting to the idea of how you are, like I said, you're not new to spirits, but you're getting into bourbon. So kind of talk about your journey and just that and sort of how it's led into what it's become today. But we'll talk a little bit more about what first attracted you to it. Is there anything that, really got you really into it, stuff like that, but kind of talk about your journey so far.
So just like anyone else, I went off to the university, and of course I drank really crappy spirits and beers and whatnot. And then I decided that my palate was maturing as I was maturing, and I started to get into vodkas, and I really couldn't differentiate the high-end vodkas, Grey Goose, Ciroc, and all the other ones that were out there. And what really inspired me was history and what goes into making the spirits vodka. Besides Dan Aykroyd saying that he could filter his Crystal Skull through diamonds in Nova Scotia, that's kind of special, I guess. But darker, more aged products like tequilas is really how I got my foot into the door. And I went off the deep end with both Patron and Don Julio and started buying some of the high-end Patrons like the Patron Platinum, and realized that there was more of a joy to sip on something versus shoot it or put it in a mixed drink. Otherwise, you were just kind of wasting it. And then one day with a tax return, I was just really stupid, and I went to a grocery store in Iowa and talked to the spirits manager and said, "Hey, can you get me a bottle of Grand Patron Burdeos?" And he just looked at me like, "Are you crazy?" And that's a $500 bottle of tequila, and he was one of 4 for the state that year. And I was able to get that bottle when restaurants were the only other people who were able to get that. Still have it, still haven't opened it. And then the tequila boom just started to be more of a hipster thing. And then I got into craft beer. My friend's a designer for a pretty big place in Omaha called Infusion Brewery. He does all the label making. Got into craft beer for a while. So just kind of got sick of that chase, going out to California, shipping back bottles, which you're not supposed to do, but shipping them back to Iowa that you can't find here. And then from there, stumbled upon when I was actually hunting for bourbon, and the history behind it, and the fact that they can put something in a charred barrel and turn something into something very delicious and have such a different expression based on age, char, and climate and conditions of where it's aged, really is what inspired me to get into bourbon. And my first one was actually the Booker's Bluegill Creek, the 2016. So I haven't been in it very long.
Okay, good. So we'll have a lot of good information to talk about. So I kind of want to rewind back and talk about the tequila and craft beer phase. So I don't know of too many people that are getting into the tequila movement and something like that. I've had the opportunity to sample a few good tequilas. Still, I have yet to jump the ship and go out and buy like 5 or 6 really good bottles of tequila. So what really made you get into that? Like, what was the attraction there?
Well, I had a best friend that I met in college, and he and I actually would go and have lunch, and we were part of a restaurant's tequila club, and we would spend about $300 for lunch, and I ate 2 tacos, he had a taco salad, the rest was shots of tequila.
Oh, wow.
And they had 300 different varieties on site, and we started just going up the chain saying, okay, well, we have more disposable income because we're young and dumb and probably should have saved that money versus spending it, but moved up to Don Julio Real, 1942, and then moved up to the top tiers with Patron, like the Platino, Piedro, what didn't exist back then, and then the creme de la creme for them is called their Grand Patron Burdeos, which I have a $500 bottle behind me. I've tasted it, but I still can't find an excuse to even open it.
So what makes a $500 tequila a $500 tequila? I mean, I'm just not well versed in it yet, and we won't dive too much. Just the last question on tequila.
No, totally. So with Patron and the higher end tequilas like Don Julio's Real is probably equivalent to it. They age it a lot longer than most tequilas, and due to the climate difference, like with Scotch, they have to age it longer because it's colder in Ireland. In Mexico, it's warm usually year round, and it's more temporal. So they age the tequila for over 12 months. They put it in French Bordeaux barrels, and it's pure agave, and that's why it's high end. So it's always going to be 100% pure blue agave. That ups the price. And then also the aging process. If it's a añejo or a super añejo, an extra aged one like a 23-year-old bourbon, it's going to be more expensive. And their maximum age time frame is about maybe 12 to 24 months.
All right. See, now I'm learning something about tequila. I'm just going to make sure I don't have to spin off, and then we'll start tequila pursuit at some point. But who knows? Yeah. So I also want to talk a little bit about craft beer, right? I've said it on before on the show that I have the utmost respect for craft beer collectors and consumers, because it is not an easy chase, and there's so many out there. Like you could drink a different beer every day for the rest of your life for the next 70 years and still not drink every type of beer that is ever going to be in existence, right? And when you want to get good beers and you want to age them, you're paying up to 30, maybe even $50 for a beer, and that just sits on the shelf for a while. And then when you open it, you've got one sitting to actually enjoy it. So what kind of made you get into the craft beer movement and then also kind of get out of it?
It's kind of like what you said. It's just that you only have one sitting to open it, and then also people just not knowing. One of my favorite ones is from Goose Island out of Illinois. They make a Bourbon County beer, which segues into bourbon. It's aged in used bourbon barrels, and it's real syrupy. We've actually had people come over to a mutual friend's house, and she just popped the bottle and was ready to pour herself a glass of it. And it's like, I think, almost 12 to 14% alcohol by itself. And I got into it because of just the lure of being able to find it in different places, like traveling, kind of like when Chick-fil-A wasn't somewhere like it was in Nebraska, and rubbing it into people who didn't have it when I was out of state. So the lure of it was, the collection, and using apps like, and maybe this is a good idea for you to create, is maybe like a bourbon app, but you would check into them. There's a app called Untapped, and you check into all the beers that you've tried. I think I maxed out at 544 different types of beers. And the funny thing about it was you could go to anywhere around the Midwest and not find a bottle of something, but you would be in Barcelona or Amsterdam or something like that, somewhere wonky, and you'd find something that it was impossible to find in the U.S., which that was kind of why I got out of it, was because I didn't want to, put my name in lottery, stand in line like the people do for the iPhones to get a certain beer. Like I said, that you can't really seal up and enjoy later. It has to be drank then and then only.
Well, now you have to stand in lotteries and wait for bourbon. So now you're just kind of just trading one for the other.
You got it. Yep.
So, I mean, Bourbon County Stout is always one of my favorites. It kicks up to around 14%. It's a solid beer. It's like soy sauce, right? That's what it tastes like. And it's actually pretty hard to finish a bottle by yourself. Ever since 2015, when they actually made the bigger bottles and not just the regular size, you almost have to share them nowadays to be able to do that. But there is somebody that said, if you're really getting a beer, and this is something that I just learned about 2 or 3 years ago, was Sam Adams Utopia. Have you ever had that?
Yes. Yeah, I've had that one. It's like molassesy, very, very thick, and it's like 100 or 200. It was, when I first saw it, it was about $100 for a bottle. I think it's gone over 200 by today's standards. But then also there's a whole other section. Like you guys were talking to the yeast guy on the show. They use spontaneous fermentation out in the California ones that specialize in sours. And they'll just open it up or throw in lactobacillica or Brettanomyces to create the sour beers. And also, which I said this to one of my spirit friends, he said, "Why did you give up beer?" And I said, "Well, the sour beer." And I said, "Well, because it gave me heartburn and it gave me indigestion." He said, "So now you're drinking, barrel-proof bourbon? That's better, supposedly?" And I said, "I think it tastes better, and I have to drink less of it to get enjoyment out of it."
Absolutely. All right, cool. So we'll go. Let's kind of move into the bourbon section of this now. So you had talked about what really got you into bourbon was the idea that you could put something into a newly charred oak barrel, it comes out and it tastes the way it does. And you had, did you say Booker's Bluegill was kind of like that first one that kind of really hooked you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really a big fan of Brown-Forman, but on my birthday last year, and it's coming up again on the 21st of this month of December, I went out with my parents, went to a sushi bar, had my first old-fashioned, and I think it was Dickel Rye was in it, and I thought it was bourbon, but my friends met up because one friend from the U.S. was back in town from South Africa, and we went to a bourbon bar called Grain at the time. It's now called Proof, and sat down, poured some Four Roses, really liked the way that it tasted, and then started talking to the bartender, getting to know more about how it was aged. Then went home and just started doing what normal people do, top 10 best bourbons, and of course Pappy comes up and the Buffalo Trace Antique ones. And I'm like, wow, I'm not going to be able to find these because I was Googling everywhere the prices. A, I couldn't afford it, and B, they're just impossible to find. Went to my local spirit store called Spirit World in Omaha and just walked up to one of the experts there, and they showed me around, and I told them what tequila I liked, and they said, well, you might like this. And I just remember taking that first sip of Bluegill Creek and having that, feeling in your cheeks with the alcohol kind of being stuck in there, almost like Listerine, but in a good way, full of fruit, cake, vanilla, and caramel flavors. And then from there, I heard there was a price increase on it. So I started hunting every single 2016 batch I could. I got the February, not the March, because that was the rye. And I got Off Your Rocker and everything besides January of that year. And then I started moving into Blanton's because that was a smooth drinking one, and realized that the distillers know, how to proof it down. Blanton's is amazing. It's probably one of my go-tos, or Eagle Rare, as far as not putting any water on it. But still, there's some lure to even, regular stag, just that barrel proof, and just the fact that they can put in a barrel for X amount of years, and depending on what char level it's at, you're going to get different flavors out of it, and you can put two together. And I like your idea of blind tasting, because it truly, it's just, to me, the science behind it is beyond me, but it's just amazing how you can have two different distilleries create something completely different just based on changing one or two factors.
Yeah. And you kind of surprised me there, because you take a little bit different approach than I think most people do that when they get into something. And we should also say that, a lot of us are more informed consumers and we want to research more, but sometimes people don't. And I don't know if you did the same exact thing where maybe you were trying to buy your maybe first or second, maybe third bottle of bourbon, and you go to the store and you just look at the shelves. I mean, was there a feeling of anxiousness, or did you really not know what to do? Were you asking for help, or you just said, well, I'm just going to play a little Russian roulette and pull something that's in a middle bit of a price range here and just go for it?
It was a little bit of both. So the owner, he pushed me to Maker's Mark 46. That was the second bottle of bourbon that I bought, besides the Four Roses single barrel. And with that, I walked in, thinking, okay, well, these are about $40, $50 bottles of bourbon. And I saw the Garrison's Brothers gray labeled this, I think the higher proof one, barrel proof. And the bartender, Elzuri, walked around and actually ended up selling me a bottle of Monkey Shoulder. But this is where I got really intrigued by it, because I was anxious about prices. He said, Garrison Brothers is kind of similar to tequila. They're down south. They have warmer climate, so they're going to be able to age their bourbon a lot quicker than they can in Kentucky. And he's like, I'm supposed to tell you to look at this, but we walked around. He showed me the differences between color, how long it's been aged, how that influences it. And then from there, I ended up walking out, I believe, with the Monkey Shoulder, and then decided to start looking at other aged bourbons outside of the Beam Suntory, wheelhouse, and even explored like Diageo's Bullet Bourbon, because everyone told me that was okay. And one day, just unknowingly, I had an anxiousness because I saw Stag Junior just all over the shelves in a Nebraska store. And my favorite spirit guy there, he said on the shelf, he's like, this is Rhetoric 23. Are you sure you want to, leave this here? And I'm like, is it rare? So I called up Elzuri and I said, hey, there's this stuff called Rhetoric 23 sitting on the shelf. Is it any good? And he's like, yeah, what's it cost? And it's like $149. He's like, grab it. And I did. I still haven't opened it yet. I've tasted at the bars, but I guess it was kind of methodical, but also taking advice from bartenders and mixologists who were honest about it, who weren't just trying to make a buck on it to sell you the most expensive stuff.
So why did you gravitate towards like grabbing a Stag Junior? Was it something that you read, or is it just you saw pictures, or is it just, I mean, what was that initial thinking?
I like Buffalo Trace. I mean, my first two expressions from their distillery was Eagle Rare and also Blanton's. So I figured that, Buffalo Trace puts out good product and it can't be too bad. And I saw Uncut Unfiltered on there. And that's goes back to the Beam Suntory Booker's variety. And I believe that's probably their direct competition, if there is any, between the two. And I just said, hey, this stuff is 137 proof. I'm not going to have to water it down. In my opinion, at the time, I actually wanted to blog about it and say that I like barrel proof more so because I can add my right amount of water. And to me, it doesn't matter whether it's limestone water or it's, mountain snow melt from Breckenridge breweries or Breckenridge distilleries water. I wanted to put, whatever water I could in there and kind of, not put it on ice and drink it straight. And that's what made me gravitate towards it, because it was barrel proof and a reasonable price.
So you were smart enough to know that it was actually from Buffalo Trace, right? But most people, they're going to walk in the store and they're going to see all these different labels and not even understand that. Yeah, like there's only really like 6 or 7 distilleries, right? And 90 labels come from these 6 or 7. So how did you figure out that information or decipher it? Because a lot of that comes from actually just having to learn knowledge about the bourbon industry in general.
It was from this podcast, just talking about the different, distilleries that are big, like Brown-Forman, Luxco making Blood Oath, and some of the other brands like Rebel Yell, which I think is owned by someone else. It's a subsidiary. But plugging a ton of time into Wikipedia and into Google as well, just looking up, this brand and then finding out who the parent company was, and then expanding their portfolio, like going to Buffalo Trace's website and clicking on their brands, and then finding out they're owned by Sazerac, and then finding, what other expressions they have under that umbrella, or Beam Suntory or Diageo as well too. So that's really what made me know that was George T. Stagg, was a Buffalo Trace expression, was just the research I put in prior to seeing it on the shelf.
So what was your reaction? Were you like, oh, okay, I mean, I guess that's what it is? Or you're like, this is just a huge scam. Like they're like, why don't they just make one thing? And then that's just what they make.
Well, I think it was a video I watched with Elmer T. Sitting in the room before I think he's deceased, if memory serves me correctly. But he was sitting in the room tasting things blindly, going, with that turning table, the old way of tasting it. And I think that the way that they explain how they do things is what encouraged me to go that direction. I mean, it's just like going back to that starting point. It amazes me that you can put something in a barrel and it comes out based on different factors. Like, for instance, you and I had a conversation on Facebook about how Pappy 20 has that funk, but 23 does not. It's a lot smoother. And for some reason, I don't know if it's just what they put into that barrel, or what goes in the mash bill, but it's just how you can put something so simple in there and adhere to the laws of it being a charred oak barrel, 51% corn, and then the other factors that make it actually be able to be called bourbon, but yet you get something so different based on how it's treated and a bunch of other things, or whether or not the yeast gets contaminated and things like that, or whether it's sour mash or sweet mash.
Yeah, I don't want to dive in the rabbit hole, but that was an anomaly. Really, it is an anomaly because Van Winkle 20 has been one of my favorite of the expressions. However, the 2016 just wasn't good. I don't know why. It just wasn't. And then I haven't had a chance to try the 2017. When you sent me that message, I was like, oh crap, it's going to be just like the 2016. So
yeah, it just has that mildewy smell. Like, it's very earthy. If that's what the 2016 tasted like, that's what it is.
Spot on. So now people know, go ahead and get rid of them. But anyway, so the other thing is, when you go and you start looking at the shelves and they're lined with all these things, you're becoming more savvy, understanding that a lot of these distilleries are pumping out more labels than maybe, I don't know, they're probably 4 barrels for every label they come out with or something, right? It's a ton. But what about NDPs? Like, was there a point where you didn't understand where this was coming from or what the idea of even source bourbon actually meant?
Yeah, I mean, it was with Jefferson's, I think, because I actually was reading the label, and my dad, he's very analytical. I was sitting next to him, and I told him why I bought it. And he said, they're saying there that they don't make their own bourbon. They're sourcing it from, established distilleries, and they're experimenting. And that's really where I just started changing my outlook, and even looking at, the less expensive bourbons as well, and looking towards craft, because at the end of the day, I don't have an infinite, source of income, and neither does anyone that I know of, unless you're Zuckerberg or Bill Gates or something to that effect. But I'm trying even in newer ones, like Costco has Bookers for $50 a bottle, and that's a lot less than what you're seeing it elsewhere. And they did get a couple Wellers in that they sold for probably less than what most people would ever buy, like what you talked about on the show. But now it's kind of like getting towards that craft side of things, where I'm trying a bunch of these craft distilleries that haven't really had the big boy price value, where they can ask for X amount just to be more diverse within my repertoire of what I've tried.
Absolutely. I mean, what is your idea of craft so far?
I think
Like,
that
what do
they're
you think?
doing pretty well. I mean, I don't really care for Breckenridge. I think that it's kind of weird that it says that it's only aged for 2 years on the back of the bottle. I mean, it's still an age statement, which is nice, but at the end of the day, some of the craft ones are good, but some are, kind of, they can be kind of garbagey, but they're trying to push out the best product possible so they can compete with the big boys and actually stand out. And maybe their end game is to be acquired by them, because I mean, not a lot of people know that, Diageo owns this and I mean, the Sazerac owns Buffalo Trace. I mean, it's just, I think that they're trying to push out the best product to get their foot in the door and use word of mouth advertising. Because unless it's Mila Kunis dancing over a bottle of, whatever she's advertising for Jim Beam,
Yeah.
yeah, you don't get to see advertising besides people like us chatting about it.
Right. Absolutely. So another question back on the NDPs real quick. When you started researching it and you became more aware of what an NDP was and you know what to look at the label, has that affected your buying habit to be able to say, I'm only going to buy something where I know where it's coming from? Or are you saying, I'll go to whim? Like if it says it came from somewhere in Indiana, I know it's MGP and it's going to be probably a decent product.
I would say that it swayed me at first, but literally, to be honest with you, sometimes I'll go to breakingbourbon.com and just get their straight up review and see whether or not it's a good value, because I think that they pour a lot of thought into there, as they discussed in your roundtable. And I think that just looking up reviews and seeing whether or not people say it's worth it or whether or not it's a pass, like when you guys tasted that Orphan Barrel that was pretty much overhyped Crown Royal and said it was crap, I probably would have bought it if I wouldn't have heard that, or there wasn't an article out there reflecting that. So to me, it doesn't really it's so much where it comes from. It's the end product and what the juice inside the bottle actually tastes like, and what people have said about it. And
Right.
so I'm not going to let their opinion completely sway me, but it's also going to keep me away from blowing $100 on something that is garbage.
Absolutely. So Catch 22 asked a question. He said, I'm curious if by now, if you found your palate preferences yet, and how's that journey progressed? Or are you still trying to figure that out as you go?
So I sat down with Joel, who's the owner of the Bar Proof in Omaha, where I had the Pappy Flight and all the Buffalo Trace Antique collection besides the Eagle Rare. And I figured out that I guess your palate gets burned out about 90 proof, and then everything just seems to taste good after that point in time. But my palate choice, as far as what I look for in it, is a caramel taste, a little bit of fruitcake, not too much spice towards the end. But I like a long finish where, you can have that aftertaste of vanilla. That's what I was chasing, even going back to the tequila days with Cabo Wabo Uno, Gran Patron Burdeos, and even Don Julio Real, versus like even a lower rung tequila, not just backtrack tequila, but to Don Julio 1942, it doesn't have that same finish on it. So definitely that's how I was able to get into Booker's, was because I was able to describe my vanilla and caramel and kind of that brown sugar taste to it.
And this is going to be a spin on Catch 22's kind of next section. He kind of want to know, you kind of talk about proof as you've kind of figured out where your balance is there. But, what about your palate when you look at high rye versus low rye versus a wheated bourbon, and what was the process of actually learning those as well?
Tasting, and also essentially just experimentation. I bought Blood Oath on a whim, and that's a high rye bourbon. The pack 3 is, at least. And I kind of like that spiciness. And for some reason, like, I even messaged you whether or not it was a good idea to buy Whistle Pig or Michter's, which I think those, to my knowledge, I know Whistle Pig is a rye whiskey, but Michter's has a little bit more rye content than some of the others as well. So I think my palate is changing to where I'm appreciating that spiciness. At first, I wouldn't drink rye whiskey to, save the world, but because it made me think of all the Jack Daniel shots that I had as a young college student. But now that we're seeing more mature ryes in there, and it's more of a delicate rye taste, I'm kind of migrating into it. It's growing on me.
Okay, good deal. So what actually, I guess this is one of those things, if you're not new to bourbon, you look at a shelf full of things and you see bourbon whiskey, and then sometimes you look down and you see rye whiskey. However, there are different rye contents. There's different wheat contents. Did you ever even think to yourself, like, I didn't even think about, this is a wheated bourbon, this is a rye bourbon. What was that process of figuring that out as well?
That's also was trial and error. I mean, I didn't know that a wheated bourbon was going to be smoother, and that's why I liked Weller. and also why I think that I are gravitated towards like just the regular green label Weller that you can find sometimes. And I was looking for more of a smooth bourbon because Booker's and some of the other ones, they punched me in the face, literally, like when you drink it because it's so hot. And like same thing with Baker's, or to me, Basil Hayden isn't as smooth as what some people say. But my development was that now that I've experimented the barrel proof, and I don't like to water down because I probably am not good at putting the right amount of water in there for, having a good taste for what my palate wants. I'm just looking at the shelf and saying, I'm going to pull the trigger on this and see if it's good. And if it's ends up being a bad choice, I'll end up sharing it with some friends maybe that aren't as close to me or as, into bourbon. Or if it's ends up being good, then it's something I'm going to rebuy. I mean, it's when you're looking at the shelf, a lot of the times I'm looking at it like a deer in the headlights, and I'm have my phone out, Googling the bourbon, seeing how good it is. And then from there, that's where that anxiety comes in of what to pull. I mean, there's lots of times I've walked into the store, looked at the shelf and said, yeah, nothing's just jumping out at me. And I would just walk out with nothing.
I mean, you kind of really jumped all in. You talked about the very beginning of just buying Booker's, right? And you're talking 115, 120 proof right off the bat. What made you go with something that is barrel proof? Because that's not typically the first foot forward that we see of most bourbon drinkers, right?
Yeah, so I think it comes from just drinking vodka, because when I drank vodka, I didn't mix it with anything. I drank straight up martinis, and I wanted to control, like, even though I'm horrible at it, control the water that was in there. And for some reason, I thought that the distillery controlling the amount of water in there was a misstep. So I think that I was wrong at first by thinking that, and now I'm appreciating even regular Angel's Envy that's only sitting at 90 proof, and it's very smooth and easily drinkable neat, because I don't really like to put ice on it, and I like it to sit there and sip on it. So I think that jumping straight into that was literally just a mistake, to be honest with you.
Yeah. It's funny you call it a mistake. I mean, but it's one of those things that you kind of you almost skip the step there, because it's typically most people they'll start off with a Makers or a Bullet or something like that, and then they'll find their way to a Booker's or to a Stag Junior, and then so on and so forth, right? So it was interesting that was the first step that you did take.
Yeah, I think part of it's also my upbringing too. My mom and dad are all very frugal people who've saved their money, and my sister and I have always had the champagne taste on a beer budget. They got her back in the 90s I think a Ford Tempo, and she had to go out and get an IROC Camaro. And I've been the same way. Like, my parents gave me a 92 Explorer. It wasn't good enough, so I had to trade it for a Beamer. I mean, just things like that. I think that's probably why. It's just the lure of saying, hey, because also social media influences as well, as being able to post, hey, I have this bottle of Rhetoric 23. Does anyone want to come join me in tasting it? Or being able to have that bottle and get into whiskey tasting groups locally, because you have that bottle and you have something to bring to the table.
So we'll talk about social media here in a second, but I want to give a shout out to somebody else that is on the live chat here that's a Patreon sponsor. And I kind of just put in there and said, share any thoughts of what was surprising or frustrating when you first got into this. And Brandon Griffith said, the biggest shock to me was the price that can vary so much from store to store. Did you experience that as well? Because now that you're seasoned, you sort of understand that there's some stores that are just going to charge $1 or $2 more. Costco's always going to be cheaper. So how did you find out about that?
Just from going from store to store, like when I was first hunting for Booker's, the whole 2016 series that I could get my hands on, I noticed the store in Papillion, Nebraska, which is a suburb of Omaha, was charging about $5 to $10 more than what the one in Midtown Omaha was charging there. And I asked the manager, they said, well, it just depends on really, and it was both Hy-Vee, which is the big grocery store chain that we have here in the Midwest. They said it just depends on how much we want to charge for the markup. So the price gouging is a real thing. And I think that, not looking what the fair price value is something that can burn you at the end of the day. Because if you walk out of a store and you paid $10 more than retail, or you go to caskers.com and pay the shipping and pay their extra markup, it kind of makes you feel like an idiot. Like my first bottle of Angel's Envy, I think I paid $75 for it. And now I just bought it from the store now that's available in Iowa and Nebraska for $49, $59.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You end up learning those little tricks over time. Catch 22 has another question for you. You see all these stickers and hang tags that you see on bottles when you go to the store, and a lot of them are saying it won a double gold at the San Francisco Whiskey Awards. Did any of those have any factors into your buying decisions early on?
No, because I think that a lot of that can be influenced by hype and sponsors and people who are influencers that just say that something's good. Like the guy who wrote the bourbon book. I mean, yeah, Booker's Rye was a good bourbon. But I think that the grassroots movement, the people that are real like you and me, and the people who write for the people who join your roundtables, who blog about it, they're the ones who really don't have a vested interest in saying this is going to be good. It's kind of comes from my photography background. If you're sponsored by Canon, you're going to say everything Canon is good. You're going to say everything from Nikon is crap. So that's really what made me pick my bourbons and choose them more wisely, was going from the reviews from grassroots versus saying, well, this is a gold medal. I mean, to me, an award is an award, and it's probably well earned. And, I'm not trying to bash on those awards too much, but I would rather hear from a human being who's actually tasted it, that's down to earth.
Right. I mean, that's one of those things that I think a lot of people don't understand, is that it's a pay to play scenario. Mm-hmm. And not only that, is when you have been entrenched in the market so long, like you don't see Jack Daniels entering themselves into whiskey competitions, but they're the number one whiskey that sells across the entire globe. Right. It's one of those things that I think it's more marketing than anything. So you end up getting through that. So I kind of want to move on to a little bit of the social side. So have you come to find yourself familiar with Facebook groups and Reddit now that you're actually getting into this? And how did you, I guess it could just be word of mouth, or could just be research of how you found out about them as well?
So the Facebook one has been more accessible. I guess Reddit, I've never really gotten into Reddit too deeply. I posted my first impression of Booker's when I tasted it, and it actually resulted in Beam Suntory sending me 2 of their snifter glasses, a note-taking book, essentially what they give to people for their tasting sessions, and a pen that said Booker's on it with a nice letter. So
go to Reddit, cool. Now, start putting in your Booker's reviews.
Yeah, but then the Reddit community came back at me, and they're like, well, hey, you're posting from your WordPress blog or whatever it was on Tumblr, I think, and they said that's goes against the bourbon reviews. You have to actually write it within there, supposedly, and so I pulled the post on there, but not too soon, because Beam Suntory was calling me up and saying, hey, we really like your post, and they actually ended up sending me one of the batch 3 Knob Creek 2001. So that wasn't too bad for taking about 20-30 minutes to write about it.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest incentive of doing it as well.
Oh, heck yeah, getting free stuff.
Yeah,
who doesn't like that?
Yeah, Reddit's about to blow up now. If it wasn't already big, now everybody knows that you get free stuff if you put Reddit reviews. I think that's an easy way to do it. So let's talk a little bit about when you get into whether you're reading reviews on Reddit or whether you're coming into some of the most popular like open sites that are on Facebook. What are your initial thoughts? Do you just become like anything? I come from the tech world, right? And you do too. Is that you just have to be a lurker at first, and you kind of have to understand how this all works, or do you just jump head in?
I think more of a lurker. I think the smartest people out there are the ones who are quiet and listen. And if you go and pretend like you know it all from the beginning, as soon as you say you get it and know everything about bourbon, then I think you're shutting off your ability to want to learn more about it. But if you sit back, listen to podcasts, search when you have some downtime, instead of watching some silly show on Netflix or something like that, watch YouTube videos about it and see what other people's opinions are, then you're going to learn more in-depth process of it. I mean, I didn't know that Elijah Craig accidentally burned the barrels to get the fish smell out of them. And that's how this accident that we had that bourbon was created. I mean, was just in a YouTube video I found one day, and that really helped me gain that appreciation of it. So, I mean, when it comes down to it, I mean, I am just so entrenched in it because the history. I mean, the fact that, everything ended up under so many few umbrellas, and the collaboration during the hard times in between each distillery, even though they're actually adversaries of each other, or competition, that's what really draws me into it, is because it seems like it's a family, even though we're all competing to try to get the same stuff when it comes to the rare or allocated stuff.
Well, don't look too deep about what people tell you of who made the first charred barrel. Cause honestly, the fish smell, that was the first time that I've ever heard that one. So
Yeah, yeah.
it's,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. Like there is the lore that Elijah Craig, I mean, I've heard the one where his house burnt down and then he got the idea to char the whiskey. I mean, it's all lore. Like nobody has any clue of where it first started. Right. So,
True.
yeah, I mean, you could take it to that. You could take that, at one point, Michter's was saying that it was the original whiskey that George Washington used to drink. But, it's just marketing, right? At the end of the day.
It's
So
lure. Yeah.
it really is. So you always have to take those a little bit with a grain of salt when you come from the marketing side. So a little bit more when you get into the groups in themselves. You said you kind of sit back and you listen and you become a lurker for a little bit. Was there anything that was brand new that you were kind of like taken back or surprised about when you are trying to read these forms, that things are maybe a little surprising that you didn't really understand maybe what people were talking about or anything like that?
I would say it's the allocation side of things, because I was really surprised when I heard that episode about allocation when you had the big 2 stores online talking about how it's essentially pay to play. How many bottles of Fireball you sell will determine whether or not you get Pappy or whether you get Buffalo Trace antique collection. And that was really surprising. So actually, I called Buffalo Trace's customer service and I said, hey, I want to make sure that Republic National Corporation, which is Omaha's or Nebraska's distributor, is not holding it, and that the stores aren't holding it to sell to their friends, because that seems to be completely unfair. And I used the example. I said, the iPhone X is coming out. They can make more of those things, but they can't create a time machine and go lay down more bottles of Sazerac 18 years ago. And say, oh yeah, people are going to go ape over this in 2018. So with that, I called him. I was very surprised to get a call from a Sazerac rep that actually does the Nebraska area. And he explained to me that, hey, we don't really put up with any of that secondary market type stuff where people are trying to resell it. And then also we're really not into we're making sure that our distributors and the stores are not holding back bottles. Everything's just, once it's on the shelf, it's going to fly off. And he said, explain to me that they really are looking for impressions like we talked about earlier.
Well, kind of talk about that, right? Talk about the impressions, because, it sounds like it's a good story. It's a good, it's about as honest as he can give it, but it's probably not the actual truth of what happens, right?
Yeah. So he said the state of Nebraska got 40 bottles, I think was the number they told me, of Sazerac 18. And he didn't tell me how many of the other ones out of that antique collection were received, but he said that they're looking for impressions. And it's been said on the show before that bourbon drinkers were probably the greediest people out there, because we want to sit there, be able to, have a sip of Pappy or whatever, our favorite bourbon, 3 or 4 nights a week for a couple months till it's gone. But that's one person enjoying it. You may, share it with someone else. Like, one of your mutual friends that likes bourbon, you may take it over to a family gathering and there's 15 people who try it. But Sazerac's rep literally said they would rather have their bourbons behind the bar, because then people are buying it by 1 or 2 ounce pours and they're getting 25, maybe 50 people drinking one bottle of something. And then that's how the word of mouth advertising spreads, because word of mouth is so powerful in the business. And that was his straightforward answer. And I said, okay, well, I guess it is what it is. And I said, but it kind of, I guess, gives some validity to the scarcity. At least I believed him in good faith that it did, more so than, how many more bottles are they going to find that are orphaned, that Diageo says is scarce, to put a price tag and a story behind it.
So what led you into kind of like just jumping in? I mean, you had mentioned you sat at the bar and you had a flight of Van Winkle, a flight of antique collection. And for me, it took me years. I mean, I was a bourbon drinker from starting in like 2006, right? It's kind of when I first started. I didn't really even know that Van Winkles and even Four Roses Limited, they didn't even exist to me until about like early 2013. That's when I even found out about them. So how did you kind of just start to get into this, and then all of a sudden you learn about these high end and rare releases?
The relationships with the bartenders that I would see, and they would be excited about it. They would say something special is coming in, and I didn't know what it was. And then also just, I think that with the influx of the bourbon bubble growing, there's been more people talking about it. And if you just search top 10 bourbons or best bourbon out there, you're going to have those ones listed. And I think it's just part of that. Going back to my champagne taste, I want the best of the best,
right?
Instead of trying stuff that may be a better value. Like the if you go for an Evan Williams, the one that the guy brought back, the one with the wrong label, that was on a previous podcast episode. I mean, those are probably a better value, but to me, I just want to say the best of the best. I guess that's could be probably classified as possibly a little bit narcissistic.
It could be. Yeah, it could be. It's always a thing is when we talk about this stuff, because I don't like to always talk about rare stuff, but it just happens because it's just what's exciting to talk about. But it is, it's like, am I creating the problem or are you the problem? Because you're new to this and you go and you start, you just want to get into it and get all the high end stuff right away.
Yeah, and I think that is the double-edged sword, but also there's some sentimental things. Like last night was the first night that I watched the sequel to the Kingsman movie, The Statesman, and I know that I have a bottle of that behind me, and I sat there and I drank that while I watched the movie just because it kind of went with it. And I noticed, all of the products from Brown-Forman were in the background, even the Herradura tequila they had poured for the guy named Tequila in the movie. So I don't know. I think part of it's being a little bit uppity and being kind of a hipster. I think the hipster movement is really what's hurting a lot of the industries. It's hurt the beer industry and the tequila industry as far as price explosion, people getting into it and then kind of abandoning it. Like there's been things I've read that people are gravitating towards aged rum. And if they do, that's great because that means that maybe bourbon prices might settle. That might be the resolution.
Absolutely. So back again to the social media side. So I guess this is one of the things that I was fascinated with. And then when I end up inviting people to groups, I always tell them, I say, make sure you sit back and you lurk. And then when you see the words like, or the letters like WLW or OFBB, like don't just go ahead. Like you have to figure out like what all those mean. So when you saw all these acronyms, like how you were able to start deciphering those?
Just the same way you do in the tech world. You have to ask someone, you have to have the humility to put the question out there and just say, I don't know what this means. Can you define this for me? And I mean, you can Google it if you want to, but a lot of the times I would even get snarky responses and there's that little link someone could send you that says, let me Google that for you. And it plugs in that string of code and it actually pulls Google and search and shows how to do it. So yeah, I would ask people, and sometimes people would give me kind of a weird look on my face, like, why don't you know this if you're drinking all this other bourbon and things like that. But you're not going to know unless you ask.
Absolutely. I think might be the next t-shirt idea for us. We're just going to have the back of our t-shirts. You just say bourbon acronyms, and then it's just going to be a whole slew of them back there.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, I'll have to write that one down.
There you go.
So now that you're getting into the scene, you're getting in. You said you have a champagne taste and on a beer budget. But at this point, what have you found is maybe the most frustrating thing with the bourbon scene?
I think that it's not being able to have what you want and having to pay maybe $50 to $60 for 2 ounces of something that you can't get a bottle of. I think that that's the frustrating part, or the fact that I jumped into the high-end stuff right away and just overlooked all the stuff that could be a more fair price point, that could actually be something that is more enjoyable and can adhere to that beer budget. I mean, honestly, you don't need to share on Snapchat and on Instagram all the bourbon that you're drinking, because frankly, most people probably don't care. And at the same time, it gets frustrating as well, because they're like, oh, this guy's been drinking bourbon since fall of 2016 and he may not even know what he has in his hands. So I think that that's some kind of a step back in the correct direction, probably for the connoisseurs like yourself who've been drinking it for a while and appreciating it for a longer period of time.
So I guess what's that advice that you can give to people that, I mean, we talked about it in a previous episode about how the community's changed to where everybody's really attacking a lot of newbies that actually come into the scene. What advice can you give to people that have been around it for a while of how they can be more welcoming to people that want to join it?
I think that the best thing to do is approach it with kindness. I think when everything in life, if you approach it with kindness versus, being on the defensive, it's going to yield better results. if someone would have just told me, Darren, instead of spending 70, 80, $100 on this, try this, see if you like it. And maybe not just handing me, the Booker's bourbon proof. Maybe that was a bad recommendation from the woman at the liquor store on that day. But I think that someone who is really lurking and sitting and listening, I think that welcoming those new people and saying, hey, start out with Bullet. Maybe start out with some Makers 46 if you want to get fancy, or start out with regular Makers, or other bourbons that are usually overlooked, like Elijah Craig, or anything from Heaven Hill like Larceny. They had it with a $20 rebate, and I got the bottle for $10 at the end of the day because they sent me a $20 check. And that's a delicious expression, but it's not going to break the bank. So I think that having, or just welcoming people in the community and telling them to gravitate towards the inexpensive stuff, I think would be a better way to help the veterans out, because then you can essentially earn your keep and then start buying the expensive stuff because you know what you're talking about. I mean, I've poured hours into this in a short amount of time at a very fast pace. But when it comes full circle, I did just jump in and just bought whatever I thought was cool.
Absolutely. So we had posed that question earlier about what's frustrating that you're getting into bourbon. Brandon Griffith said crotch shots, or is what's frustrating to him. I don't know if I think I'm over it, but I don't know about you.
Yeah. I think that's it's tough. I mean, it's like trying to get into anything else. I mean, even when I played golf and trying to ask my friends who played more often what clubs to get, they would tell me the top end ones, but that's not something that's allocated. You're always going to be able to buy whatever you need to buy.
Yeah, you can manufacture some new pings, that's for sure.
Exactly. I'm more of a Cobra guy, but it's okay. I won't hold it against you.
Let's see. So 22, or was it? Oh, Bill Nell had a good question. He says, you had mentioned that you were waiting in lines for the beer scene. Are you surprised that people are also waiting in lines and lotteries for bourbons as well?
I'm not surprised by it, but I don't participate in it because the people who are dedicated enough to wait in those lines, I think, deserve the ability to have the chance to taste it. If I see something on the shelf that's rare, I'm going to snag it. But I'm not going to text 5,000 people that I know and say, hey, go out and buy this, because I want those people who are veterans, who not truck chasers, but people who are out on the hunt, just regular average Joes, to be able to have those expressions that they seek and not just stand in line in there as a newbie. I don't think that a newbie really has a place to stand in line and do that, because you couldn't even really have the banter, the conversation with someone. That you could listen, but I don't think you could really add any value to the conversation while you're waiting in line with those veterans.
That's probably the most real and honest answer I think that that's really good, because I mean, around here, it is what it is, right? And people they'll bring their moms and their brothers and their cousins, and there's just all, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's people that we've got a local group that's got over 1,200 people in it, and every single one of them will be at every single raffle, even though there's only about maybe 50 to 100 people that actually communicate and actually participate in that group, right? A lot of them are not only they're lurkers, I would consider them leechers of what's going on, but that's just me. So we'll wrap it up a little bit. So one of the last questions, there was a pretty funny one that was coming from Catch 22. And he said, and it applies to me too. He says, have you started hiding bottles from your wife or significant other yet?
Yeah, I've had to hide those bottles, and I worked a ton of overtime and got that sinus infection that seems to get, the whole country had. And I brought in that bottle of Statesman, and also I think it was some other higher end bourbon, and I'd have it in the brown bag, and I would wait for that opportune time to sneak it into the house. And it's
yeah. Bill says that he has a 1792 225th sitting in his car right now. He has to bring when the wife's out. And then Brandon Griffith says that he stuffs Russell's reserve picks in his work bag to just be able to sneak them inside. So, and yeah, I got to do the same thing, right? I mean, it's just they seem to multiply like bunnies every single time I go to the store, and I can't help but help support my local. And when I do that, I've got more bourbon than I could probably drink, at least in this lifetime, but that's okay.
Yeah, there were 12 extra bottles that I just took in for recycling on the shelf behind me, which is my dresser. But with that, it was kind of sad because I turned them in for a nickel a pop, which is Iowa's return rate, and I'm like, some of these were quite expensive, and it's hard to let them go, but it looks a little bit better as well. Not to have all those empties.
At least you get money for them. I get to turn mine into somebody that's been on the show before, to turn them into candles. That's all I get out of it. So
not too bad.
Yep. So Darren, I want to say thanks again for coming on the show tonight. It was a pleasure to kind of get the ideas of what it's like to be, getting new into the bourbon scene and understanding, what are the frustrations, what surprises you, everything like that. So I think you did a really good job of explaining what it is to a lot of people, because we've all been in your shoes at some point, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, and honestly, it's just kind of like anything else. You should probably dip your toes in it before going full force, because regret is something that you can't go back on. And I mean, I could have easily bought probably a dozen bottles of Russell's Reserve, and that's an amazing bourbon expression, in my opinion, for a good, fair price. And instead of buying, rhetoric that I'm probably not going to open up until I can find a good occasion to do so.
Well, good deal. So Darren, again, thanks for coming on. So I guess if you want to pitch your blog, you can go with that. If you're putting reviews on there, if you've decided that, hey, I'm going to get free stuff by putting on Reddit, then what's your Reddit username too?
Blog, actually, on Mind of Things, it's called Wrecked Millennial, because I was actually feeling sorry for myself with the whole student loan debt situation, and companies not really liking you having a master's. But yeah, it's Wrecked Millennial. There's some posts on there, and I also plan on opening up a YouTube channel. We kind of leaked it out earlier when we were talking privately. It'll be Gratitude is what my pen name is going to be, and I'm going to be doing some product photography of the bourbon using my photography background. So it'll look professional, like it's been done, by one of the brands. And that way we can, maybe highlight some of the bourbons out there that don't get as much publicity.
Well, good. Then you can give that Instagram icon, Whiskey with a View, a run for his money then, right?
Yeah. And if anyone wants to check out the current photos that I've shot that are non-bourbon related, it's MEMPXL on Instagram. And there's photos that my dad and I have shot. We've been lucky enough to travel to Europe multiple times, and also to China, which gives you a whole new outlook on the world when you get to see all those different cultures and how they live versus how we live here in the States.
Now, aren't you mad that you weren't trying to hunt for bourbon back in Europe and China when you were there?
Yes. Yeah. That is a regret as well too. Instead of looking at beer.
Believe me too. I remember even years ago traveling for work, and I was just like, man, I was in Minneapolis and Arizona and like all these places. And this was like before the craze happened. I was like, why did I not buy?
Yeah. If only there was a time machine, I would go back and get it all. And then what I would do now is pay it forward to all the veterans who have been looking for it like you, and I would hand it out. Honestly, that's the only reason I went and got my master's, was because I wanted to get to a financial position where I could do what that guy does in Kansas City and give people $100 on Christmas who need it. Give back, pay it forward. And
look at you. You're a saint.
Hey, I appreciate it, man. I'm ornery sometimes, but I want to make sure that I can lead people in a better place than where I found them. And I think you guys do that with every episode you push out. I appreciate it, Darren, and you're a good human for talking about that too. That's awesome. I know you're definitely better than most of us who are the most selfish people in whiskey are the bourbon lovers. So hey, give yourself some more credit, because you're doing a good job, and I appreciate everything you do. And thank you so much for the opportunity to sit down and chat with you today. You got it. Well, thank you, Darren. And if you like what you hear, make sure you support us on Patreon. It's PATREO. What is that? patreon.com/bourbon pursuit. You can also subscribe to us. Actually, always subscribe to us on iTunes. Also subscribe to us on YouTube if you're one of those people that just loves to watch the video and have it playing in the background, or you're sitting there at work. Go ahead and make sure you subscribe there. And then also follow us on all those great social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Bourbon Pursuit. If you have any questions, if you have any show suggestions, you want to send us hate mail, you want to send us fan mail, you can do that as well. It's the duo, THEDUO at bourbonpursuit.com. With that, Darren, thank you again for joining the show, and we will see everybody next week.